All right, how's everybody doing? All right, I'm excited about this transition we're going to make here from this. Lots to process and think about from these presentations. I hope that after this evening you're able to continue the conversations that are started here that these national speakers have brought for how to be agents of unity and love in a very divided time, in a divided nation. I'm excited now to switch gears a little bit and turn our focus to our panel of local speakers. We have 3 people here who are going to talk to us about things to consider as we seek to raise up a healthy next generation. Each of these speakers are local. This is the city where they live. This is the city that they love. Each one of them serves to help bring healing and wholeness to many areas of our community that need help and care. So we're going to get right now into our time with them, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Sissy Goff. I love Sissy Goff. The work that she does has directly benefited my family in deeply meaningful ways, and I can only assume that many of you in this room would say the same thing. I don't think you can throw a rock without hitting somebody who has been blessed by the work that Sissy Goff does. In 1993, since then, she's been the director of child and adolescent counseling at Daystar Counseling Ministries here in Nashville. Sissy has sat across the table from more families and kids in this city than anybody. And she's had her finger on the pulse of the struggles and the fears both kids and parents feel, and the unique pressures that come with the territory of living in this city at this time. She brings a wealth of information and experience, and also a deep affection for the city that she serves, and that's a beautiful combination. And so I'm so thankful that Sissy is with us, and I'm glad that we get to hear from her now. Please welcome Sissy Goff.
This has been a fascinating evening, hasn't it? I'm excited to be here with you all talking about, good, I'm glad that's still up there, besides the clock, raising healthy adolescents, sorta. And I want to start off with the sorta. When Scott Sauls called and asked me if I would talk about raising healthy adolescents, my first thought was healthy adolescents. I don't know that I would normally put those 2 words in the same sentence. Just by nature of what we know to be true about development, there are so many changes taking place inside of them. In their brains and their bodies, they're kind of in this constant state of upheaval. A mom came to my office and told me that her daughter had come home from school crying and said, "Mom, I don't know what's going on with me. I've just been so sad and so up and down emotionally." And she said, "I really am worried I might be bipolar." And her mom's response was, "Oh, honey, there's no way you're bipolar. You're never that happy." But they're just all over the place, as we know, those of us who love adolescents. And so the concept of healthy in adolescence is complicated. And I also want to say, as we're launching into the portion of the evening on healthy, I feel a little bit about health, like C.S. Lewis talked about humility, when he said, "The humble man will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all." That if you think you are not conceited, you are very conceited indeed. And probably any of us who think we're healthy aren't. But hopefully we're progressing toward it. And those of us who are adults that love adolescents are leading them in the progression. So I want to tell y'all, actually I want to start with some sentences that teenagers have shared with me in my office in the last 6 months or so. "I've been thinking about killing myself because this world doesn't deserve me. I don't want to start this self-growth thing. I just want to be mad. The closer I get to Jesus, the more I realize I treat other people like peasants." Don't even know what to say about that one. "I don't want to grow. I just want to be understood. You can either feel or you can function." And let me tell you a story I heard not too long ago. I was counseling a girl who had come to Daystar for depression. She'd been cutting herself. We worked together for several months. She was starting to do better. And she was invited on spring break with this friend with whom she had a pretty conflictual relationship. And so they went off together and got into an argument, and the girl that I counsel went into the bathroom, took a razor, started to cut herself, texted her friend, and said, help, which was great. The friend's response, literally, you all, the friend's response was, I'll be there in a second. I'm standing on the balcony thinking about jumping off. Something's wrong. They're not healthy. We're often not healthy. And I have counseled teenagers now for 24 years. And I honestly would say that in the last 3 years, there's been a more drastic change than ever before. And I believe kids today are more entitled than ever, and I would say even emotionally entitled. They're more entitled, less equipped. They feel more power, but less purpose. They have more curiosity, but I think less of a genuine sense of connection. I think they feel less hope, less of a sense of who they are, and less of a belief that God has really called them to make a difference. We have to do what we can to change the climate these kids are living in. And I think that starts with conversation. And I do want to say, obviously, anxiety is considered a childhood epidemic in America today. Probably 8 out of 10 of the new families that are coming to Daystar now are coming for that reason, where I counsel. Depression and suicide rates are skyrocketing among kids. Those things are so real and something we need to be addressing. With kids, we need to be talking about, we need to be helping them work through. But I think part of what's happening too is these kids who have big emotions and need big words to describe their emotions are running out of room. And as they're doing so, I think they're losing 2 things primarily. The first is perspective, the second is resourcefulness. The perspective thing makes sense. When we were growing up, not that we're all the same age, but those of us who are adults in the room, when we were growing up, probably the worst thing we could think of to say was, I'm going to run away from home. Today, we have kids who are as young as 8 who are coming to our offices saying, I want to kill myself. We had a 9-year-old today. Their parents will say, I don't even know how they've heard of that. I have kids diagnosing themselves weekly in my office. Again, don't know where they learn the terms. Probably 60 to 70% of the adolescent girls I see tell me that they've had a panic attack at some point along the way. Some really have had panic attacks. And for some, I try to explain that none of us can breathe when we cry really hard. It's not a panic attack. Several years ago, a girl came to see me who told me that her mom had hit her in the stomach. And I knew this girl, I knew her mom. I didn't think her mom had probably hit her. But I'm a mandated reporter, and so I had to pursue the situation further. We talked for a lot longer, and what she ended up saying to me was, what my mom said to me hurt me so badly that it was like she hit me in the stomach, and I needed somebody to listen. So I've started talking about this thing in my office a lot with families because of all this, and that's just a scale, kind of like when you go to the ER and there's the scale with the faces, 1 to 10. So I've started talking about an emotional scale with kids. We think about 1 to 10 and emotions. Because part of what I think is happening is for adolescents today, and even kids who are younger, when the 1s and 2s and 3s are coming in, they're registering them all as 10s. They've lost perspective in that way. And so what I will tell parents to do a lot is in a moment when things are calm and okay, talk about a scale, talk about what a 10 is. What's the worst thing your child can imagine happening? And it's great to talk about as an adult if you have teenagers. And we need to do it alongside of them. So what's the worst thing they can imagine happening? And so then when your adolescent gets in the car after school and says, this is the worst day I've ever had in my whole life, you can listen and then say, tell me what it is on your scale. We want them to be able to feel and to function, both. That's what it's going to take to work through life. The second thing they've lost is resourcefulness. And a friend of mine said to me recently, I wish when I was growing up, my mom had said, you've got this, more than let me get this for you. I think we're saying, let me get this for you way too much. We're connecting the dots for them. We're problem solving for them. Honestly, I think we're so busy being their resources that they're not developing resourcefulness. And I think we're coddling them too much too, at every age. And we have a summer camp at Daystar, and a parent came up to me when she was picking up her son from camp this summer and said, I'm so thankful that my son wasn't stung by a bee this week. It would have taken him out for the entire week. We all get stung by bees all the time. Those are the 1s and 2s and 3s on the scale. We've got to feel and function. And what even anxiety specialists will say is that to work through our anxiety, we basically have to do the scary thing. So, how can we change the conversation with teenagers? What can we do to create both of these things? I've started using 2 words in my office with parents of teenagers the most, and I literally repeat them over and over, even as they're walking out my door. Empathy and questions. Empathy and questions. That we want to hear them so that they don't have to use big words just to get our attention. We want to listen, and then we want to ask them questions. What do you think would help that situation? Who do you want to be in that? What do you feel like God has called you to do in the midst of that? Questions create resourcefulness. And I firmly believe kids need resourcefulness to get through life. They need perspective too. I think real health involves both for all of us. When we listen to kids and help them find their way to problem solve, we're basically communicating to them that we believe that they're capable. That's what we want them to hear. We want them to believe they're strong and resilient and brave, that who they are makes a difference, that they have a voice, and that they matter. And I strongly believe that if more adolescents believe they mattered to us, to God, and to the world, we'd have more health, and they'd experience a whole lot more hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Sissy. We're going to have some Q&A after all 3 of our local speakers have had their opportunity up here, but thank you, Sissy, for that. That's great. Our next speaker, you will be hard-pressed to find anyone who is more deeply entrenched in the inner workings of Nashville than our next speaker. If I were to name all of the ministries and social and civic organizations that Brenda Haywood has served and continues to serve in here in Nashville, we would be here for a long time. But let me name a few. Brenda is a Nashville native. She is a Nashville City Councilwoman for District 3. She's an ordained minister and a retired Nashville Metro Schools teacher and administrator. She has degrees from Tennessee State University, Trevecca, Nazarene College, and Vanderbilt. She's also the founder and CEO of Royal Air's Youth Academy, which is a nonprofit that aims to empower our youth through awareness, education, information, mentorship, and community resources. In addition, that organization is designed to effectively satisfy the classes and community service hours that are assigned to at-risk juveniles through the juvenile court system. And so I'm thankful to have Brenda with us this evening to speak on the topic of at-risk youth from an educator's perspective. Please welcome Brenda Haywood.
Thank you. First of all, I consider it an honor and a pleasure to stand before you tonight. Sissy was so awesome, and I know I can do this. In part, 9 minutes doesn't seem like a long time, but as you think about it, it's time enough to get your point across. I like to say that after being in the educational profession for probably 30 years, I asked my kids to pick a poem that really spoke to who they were. And I'd like to read this poem to you. It's called Society's Child. And then I'd like to tell you a little parable. It says, there is something inside trying to get out. It is banging and screaming and raging. It wants to be in control, in demand, clawing and scratching and bombarding the walls that keep it entrapped. There's something inside trying not to wither. It wants to stay alive and thrive. It's getting so tired of being locked away deep down inside. There's something inside that is surviving by one thought and one thought alone. that it will be free someday when I am no longer afraid to be me. These young people, they're called at risk. What I found out, that all kids in one way or another are at risk. And let me tell you what defies the term at risk. I tell my kids, if you're not loving, you're not living. You have to be able to impart the love of God when it comes to the young people. And people often ask me, why did you start this organization? Well, I'm going to tell you why I started the organization. It's because I was called to teach at a school for kids that had been expelled from all of Metro City schools. They were called at-risk kids. As I taught them, they would tell me, Miss Haywood, no one loves us. We have come from broken homes. We come from a broken society. Everything about us is broken. Well, I knew then I had to be a change agent. I had to love these kids into what God had purposed for them. I told them that they were royal heirs, that God had a plan and a purpose for each and every one of them. I told them once they went home to read Jeremiah 29:11, it talked about what God had planned for them. We couldn't talk about it in school because everything that had to do with Jesus, everything that it had to do with religion was removed from school. I'm going to tell you about the home I was brought up in. I had a wonderful mom and a wonderful father. But at the age of 12 in 1963, I found myself taken from the setting that I had been nurtured in from K through 4. I was thrust into Stratford High School. Well, at that time, it was 7th through 12th grade. I was the only black in the school. When I walked in, there was Mr. Webb. And if I had to take a subject for my little speech today, my 9 minutes, it would be my white daddy. When I walked into Stratford, I walked up the stairs, and there was a white guy about 35 years old with what I thought was a halo over his head. When I walked in, he says, "How are you?" I says, "How would you be?" I'm 12 years old. It's 1963. There are 2,000 kids here, and I'm the only black. He said, "It's going to be all right." Well, I didn't believe that. And this wasn't a part of what I was going to say tonight, but I'm trying to convey, if you're not loving, you're not living, and you have to love a child out of that child's brokenness. Because all kids come to you with their culture and their circumstance, and oftentimes there is more brokenness over here than it is over here. You have to love them out of their brokenness. And I learned that through my white daddy. There I found myself in a strange land, a land that was quite unusual for me. I had come from a land of love. Now I'm in a land of a lot of hatreds. But there was my white daddy that felt like if he wasn't loving, he wasn't living. And each and every day he came to me and he says, "How are you doing today?" I said, "Today I'm a little less unhappy than I was yesterday." So each day he would make it his business to come and love on me in the Mr. Webb kind of way. Eventually I found out that it didn't matter what color you were. It didn't matter what size you were. It didn't matter what age you were. If you were not loving, you were not living. When I became an adult after graduating from Stratford High School, and he loved me all the way through, and I became a teacher. At that point, I knew how to love my kids out of a tendency to want to kill themselves. I learned to love my kids out of a tendency to want to cut themselves. I learned to love my kids out of a place where they thought they were less than someone else that may not have looked like them. I learned how to love my kids into a place that God had prepared for them. And I learned that primarily through my white daddy, because coming from the home that I came from, love was such a natural thing. Then when I became a minister, I taught my kids even more how to love from a godly perspective. And as kids would come to me and say, Miss Haywood, I don't want to go to the other classes. And I says, why not? They said, because they don't love us like you do. Finally, I retired and I started preaching. And I ran into my white daddy and I invited him to something that I was having, to learn that he had a heart attack and he died before he could come. He was 84 in 2014. Oh my God, when I think about they called me and told me he had died. And they said, Brenda, we have something that we need you to do. And that's what they told me, that they wanted me to eulogize my white daddy. They said he didn't want his pastor to eulogize him. He wants you to eulogize him. If I had to leave you with one message, it is the only way you can find yourself living is if you find yourself loving. So from an educator's perspective, the only thing I can tell you, if you have the privilege to be in the face of a child that is at risk, you love him into a place of wholeness. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Brenda. Beautiful. I met our final local speaker 10 years ago at a conference in Chicago. I knew him through his music before I knew him as a friend, but over the last decade, his friendship has been a steady source for me of encouragement in my own creative and vocational journey. Andrew Peterson is an acclaimed singer-songwriter and award-winning author of The Wingfeather Saga and the founder of The Rabbit Room, which exists to foster Christ-centered community through story, art, and music. He lives here in Nashville with his wife and 3 children. Andrew is one of the most creative people that I've ever met, and he's also one of the most grounded people I've ever met, and that's an extremely rare combination. And so I'm glad that he could be here with us tonight. Please welcome my friend, Andrew Peterson.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. So I texted Russ this week and said, hey, man, I've been working on my talk, and I got it down to 7 minutes and 54 seconds. And he said, okay, that's great. It'll give you some breathing room. And I texted back and said, wait, it's supposed to be 8 minutes, right? And he said, no, 9. So I just thought I would just kind of sit here and burn down a minute. Just watch that clock tick down. Just kidding. Okay, so it was the 1980s. You guys remember the 1980s? Anybody who watched Stranger Things will remember the 1980s. And I experienced something that I call imaginational disunity. Let me explain. Picture a kid with a mullet and Converse All-Stars. He's sitting in his bedroom with an acoustic guitar. About 15 feet away from the church parsonage where he lives is the fellowship hall of the church. two very separate worlds divided by a sidewalk. The kid does a terrible job of tuning his guitar, but he gets it close enough to play along with the Lynyrd Skynyrd or Tom Petty or Pink Floyd song he loves at the moment. His fingers start to hurt, so he puts the guitar away, and he sneaks the Dungeons & Dragons box out from under his couch. He gets his sketchbook, and he tries to draw some monsters for a while, but he's as bad at that as he is at guitar playing, so he finally grabs a Dragonlance book, and he reads adventure stories. Everything in that kid's life that moves him is contraband. He is not supposed to listen to rock and roll. He is not supposed to have the D&D Dungeon Master's Manual under his couch. He is not supposed to be reading pulp fantasy novels. His Bible, meanwhile, sits on a shelf and gathers dust. My mom and dad were good parents, truly. In addition to feeding us with a wealth of casseroles and fried chicken and good sugar cereal, they had us on a steady diet of memory verses. We were in VBS and Sunday school, youth meetings and youth conferences, and watched videos that explained why rock music was evil. One of them said that the band Journey was satanic because their album covers had spaceships that looked like scarab beetles, and scarab beetles were a part of ancient Egyptian religion, and therefore if we liked the song Don't Stop Believing, then we were on a fast track to seances. And worse, playing Dungeons & Dragons. That was the other part of it, you see. Anything with a dragon in it was viewed with suspicion. But I was enamored with dragons. Half the reason I read Revelation was all that business about the great dragon. For a kid like me, whose imagination was potent and hungry, I was deeply confused. On one hand, I was told that the things that woke me up and stirred me to the possibility that life could be a great adventure was evil. While on the other hand, I was told that the gospel, the Bible, church were things that I ought to love, and those were the very things that put me to sleep. C.S. Lewis, in describing why he wrote the Narnia books, said, "Suppose that by casting all," I'm going to do full British, "suppose that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them appear in their real potency. Could not one thus steal past those watchful dragons?" Oh. For me, those watchful dragons were the ones that convinced me that a life of wonder and fullness could not include a life of ministry, a life oriented to the building of God's kingdom. Many times after watching my father get home from a long, hard day as the pastor of a small church, hospital visits, funerals, sermon prep, board meetings, church politics, my mom would make hilariously passive-aggressive statements at the dinner table. While passing the green beans, she would say, "Well, I certainly hope at least one of you kids goes into the ministry." My brother and I would look at each other with panic in our eyes. Ministry, as we understood it, meant an abandoning of everything that we loved. There was the world of the church, which denied the art that moved us, and there was the world of the arts, which we were told was in opposition to Christianity. Art and faith were two opposite ends of the world. They were the North and South poles. I assumed that to embrace one would be to shun the other. And then, by the grace of God, everything changed. I'm going to tell you how. 3 ways. I encountered art by Christians that was honest and true and beautiful. 2, I discovered that there was, in fact, a seat at the table of Christianity for nerdy kids who loved to draw dragons, who loved good music, and who loved film and story. And 3, I was shown a sacramental view of the world. First, I was asked to play piano for a friend, this was the year after high school, who wanted to sing a Rich Mullins song at church. With a great deal of belly aching, I agreed to listen to and learn to play a song called If I Stand. Late one night at the church piano in the empty auditorium, I heard a broken, raspy voice sing the words, "There's more that rises in the morning than the sun. There's more that shines in the night than just the moon. There's more than just this fire here that keeps me warm in a shelter that is larger than this room." His songs were beautiful. They not only painted a picture of a world that was brimming with beauty, but they were crafted with deft poetry and were full of mystery. He wrote passages like this: "From the place where morning gathers, you can look sometimes forever till you see what time may never know. How the Lord takes by its corners this old world and shakes us forward and shakes us free to run wild with the hope that this thirst will not last long, but it will soon drown in a song not sung in vain." And it rhymes. So his songs were beautiful, but they were also honest. He sang, "I'm reeling from these voices that keep ringing in my ears, all these words of shame and doubt, blame and regret. I resonated with the shame and the regret and the painful longing he described. I was lonely. I had regrets. I ached for something that I couldn't name and I couldn't see. He gave me permission to feel those things. But his songs weren't just beautiful and honest, they were true. By that I mean they were steeped in the truth of Scripture. All those verses I had memorized as a kid kept showing up in those lyrics and were now shimmering with light and life and authority. Never had I encountered anything quite like it. Art that was beautiful, honest, and true. Those three things are the recipe for what I believe is the most powerful and world-changing art. So second, I began to see that all of us, even the nerdiest outliers like myself, had been called to ministry. Not necessarily ministry as career, but ministry as vocation, and there's a difference. The building of God's kingdom does not apply merely to theologians and paid pastors, but to everyone, whatever their gifting. Every single man, woman, and child is a bearer of the image of God and has it in their power either to draw attention to or away from the kingdom of God. That means that we're all called to create. To use J.R.R. Tolkien's word, we're all sub-creators, little creators under orders from the great creator to make and to make and to make, to build signposts to the kingdom. There's a seat at the table for you and for me. That's part of why I buck against the nouning of the adjective creative to describe creative people. There is no such thing as a creative. All that does is create an us-them mentality that degrades the God-given creativity in every person, whether or not they're an artist. Everyone's creative, whether you're an accountant or a painter. You're a sub-creator and you are building a world every day, whether you know it or not. That is part of why we started the Rabbit Room, a publishing house, a yearly conference, a website, an ongoing concert series to build community centered around the gospel and the belief that we are all called to tell the story of the new creation, no matter what our gift is. Finally, I began to understand what it means to have a sacramental view of the world. A few years ago, I realized that all 5 of the books that I was reading at the time, all those books, all the authors had one thing in common. I was reading the poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins, the stories of Flannery O'Connor, the fiction of G.K. Chesterton, the memoirs of Thomas Merton, and the myths of J.R.R. Tolkien. I was drawn to each of them because of their wordcraft, their faith, and the power of their imaginations. Each of those 5 authors was a Catholic. I was shocked and a little panicked, to be honest. I asked an Anglican priest friend of mine what was up, and he said, "Oh, that's an easy one. It's because you're an artist." Catholics, he told me, look at the world as a sacrament. To have an integrated imagination means seeing that the world is brimming with God's presence. Every single beautiful thing can be a window into the great mystery of God. So what would it look like if the church valued art that was honest and beautiful and true? What would it look like if we kept our eyes peeled for the God-given gifting of every single human? What would it look like if we saw that the world was flooded with God's presence? If we remembered, in the words of David Dark, that there's not a secular molecule in the universe? I believe it would mean that those kids who think that they have no place in the church would be enabled to use their gifting, whatever it is, to build signposts to the kingdom. They would see themselves as the hands and feet of Christ, striding into the broken world to make all things new. Thanks.
I want to invite Brenda and Sissy and Andrew to go ahead and join me up here on the stage. We're going to have a moment of Q&A here for about the last 15 minutes of our time together. I want to explain how this is going to work. We have 2 microphones here at the front. Scott and Gage are going to be able to run these up and down for anybody who has questions. You can ask your questions to any of these 3 or the entire panel if you like. Please keep your questions as concise as you can, and then when it's time for us to wrap up our time together, I'll bring us to a close. So do we have anybody who has a question that they want to ask one of our panelists? Raise your hand high. All right, right over there. He's going to throw it. Here you go.
Now Gage is the I appreciate everyone's talks tonight. And as you're kind of talking about children and sort of the process of growing up, I'm just curious kind of what your perspective is on kind of where we are in our society, because I feel like so much of parenting can be sort of managing your kids versus sort of helping them grow and kind of discover their own humanity. And there's one sense where as you're talking about kids really struggling with, like, what does it mean to even exist when you're at risk or just, they're depressed. There's a sense of where's Christ come into all this and how does faith get transferred? Because as parents, there's one sense where we're the conveyors of faith, and yet at the same time, it feels like maybe the whole process of conveying faith and parenting gets in the way of that. So could you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Well, the whole process of what gets in the way?
Well, just there's sort of a sense of wanting to kind of pass on our faith. There's almost a sense of, Andrew, as you're talking about even your parents wanting to pass on faith, there's sort of a sense of what they intended wasn't necessarily what happened. And so there's sort of a sense of, what does that look like when we talk about sort of the confusion in today's society?
Can I
speak
to that?
Jump in, yeah.
In terms of passing on faith, I think it's something that has to be, whatever you want your child or whomever to learn, I think it has to be modeled. I know when I was growing up, and in the beginning, my parents were not just exuberant when it came to spirituality, but it's one thing for sure, they knew we had to get our education, so they modeled that. They got the education and they wanted us, they talked about it. So when it comes to faith, I'm a minister, and my grandson, he's like, what are you going to be doing tonight? Studying the Bible. And he talks to me about it, we talk about it, and I did the same thing with my kids. I just kind of demonstrated my faith in every setting. If it was something that was disparaging, I said, well, it's going to be okay, because we're going to have faith that God will just see us through. So I really think as a parent, you have whatever you want your kids to become, you have to demonstrate, model and demonstrate it.
I would say that I try to demonstrate what a complete screw-up I am as often as, and I'm not kidding, like our family tends to be pretty open about our weakness and what we're struggling with, the questions that we have. We have lots of conversations about the real stuff that's going on, and Christianity is just an ongoing part of the conversation. I heard somebody say one time that Christianity ought to be as natural, taken for granted in your home, it ought to be as natural as cornflakes and dirty laundry. So I think that whether or not it works, my kids are teenagers, ask me again in 20 years. We'll see how it is.
I think the only thing I would add to that is I think when we think about adolescence particularly, that what becomes truth for them is so much of what they discover. And so watching and having conversations where they're freed up to have their own sense of discovery in it, I think is so significant.
That's good. Does anybody else? Thank you for that question. Yeah, back there.
Hey, someone who was raised in white picket suburbia can definitely identify as questions for Sissy specifically. For the kids in our generation who have kind of been raised kind of like padded, and so we're in this participation award, kind of growing up in that era. What do you recommend we as like the future parents, how do we kind of correct or adjust to that for our children?
I had such a hard time understanding for some reason feedback.
Yeah, it's echoey here.
Yeah, so kind of that everyone gets a trophy. Is that what you're saying now, kind of that we're correcting?
Yeah, like how do we correct that for future generations so we raise them safely, obviously, but kind of introduce them to risk or introduce them to things that would maybe build their character instead of expecting kind of just a safe life?
Instead of, I love the idea of being a screw up in front of them. I think letting them fail, that feels like part of the problem to me, is that we're trying so hard to prevent them from failing. And so I think giving them opportunities where they have to struggle, they have to put themselves out there, they have to have courage. And I think also speaking to that and acknowledging that, I think part of what even concerns me about the health focus is I almost feel like we're over-encouraging, that we're just calling out the good so much, which obviously is so important to call out the good, but we all fail. And so to acknowledge the failure in it too, and that's not all of who you are. It's a part of who you are, and there's so much good in you. And I'm going to love both of those parts because that's where we find grace anyway. And so I think to tease those things out and make that just a normal part of what we talk about in our homes, I think is really helpful.
And I think also, to speak to that, to piggyback on what you were saying, Sissy, is that oftentimes when our kids fail, we show such disappointment. We're so disappointed in them. And I think we have to love them through their failures just like we do the successes. And it goes back to you saying that we have to show them that we're not perfect and we also fail. But I think at the end of the day, I just think love is really the answer, because we're going to all, the Bible tells us we're going to all fall short. And I just think if we just show them that we love them, and at the end of the day, if they feel secure in, you know, I'm going to fail, and we demonstrate the love that Christ is going to have for them, and I think that they'll be okay.
Yeah.
While you're taking the microphone over there, my son when he was younger, he participated in sports leagues and brought home all the participation trophies. And he was in this on this baseball team, little kids, you know, kid pitch, and his team did well. Like, he'd always been on terrible teams, and he only got participation trophies, and they never had a place on the shelf. Kids know that participation trophies don't mean anything. Like, intuitively, they know. They like, what's this?
Thanks.
I have this picture of him. His team came in second place in this big tournament, and it came down to the last inning. And I have this awesome photo of my son holding a second place trophy and just tears streaming down his face because it mattered. You know, he had to actually achieve something in order to feel the weight of that moment. It's one of my favorite pictures of him.
And how awesome that it was second place.
Yeah.
I love that. Instead of first.
It was quite an emotional quandary for him.
Yeah.
You know? I should feel good, but I feel terrible. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name's Sherry. I'm actually from Cleveland, so I've only been in Nashville for a short time. And I didn't really come from a situation that was like white picket fence suburbia. I came from a pretty broken neighborhood. And so I kind of really understand a lot of what was being talked about. And I just kind of want to touch base on asking what all of your thoughts are on how technology and social media is affecting the way that adolescents kind of view the world. Because as much as parents have an effect on kids these days, I know firsthand that a lot of what we know and discover isn't at home. And a lot of what we see can be tarnished by what we see in school or on social media, and how women, especially now, are like viewing themselves and their bodies, and how young men are viewing their manhood and how they should, you know, be treating or not treating women. And I kind of just want to know what y'all's views are on approaching the situation now, because looking at kids that are, you know, ages 5 and up, they've grown up with it now. They've had it in their hands.
Yeah. When I was thinking about this talk, I was with a group of adolescent girls, and I asked them what they would say the hardest things were about being healthy today. And the two things they said were social media and comparison. And I think, and those are really almost from a counseling perspective, and then y'all jump in, but I think two different animals, because technology, I mean, one of the things in terms of this rise in anxiety in our culture is technology is part of the issue, because just even how inundated we are with images and things changing so fast, it keeps our brains ramped up in this way where we stay in kind of an anxious place. And so there's that piece of it that's complicated for them. But the social media, I just can't even imagine what it's like to be a teenager today. I mean, how much it was hard for us to hear about not being invited to something, but now they're seeing it all the time. And so I think that's, as you said, that's made the comparison piece of it so much harder. And so I feel like we want to, from a technological standpoint, it's so important to safeguard kids and have really good things in place to do that. And from a social media standpoint, to protect them as much as we can, knowing it's really how they communicate today. And so to have a lot of really good conversations. I tell kids all the time, loneliness does not show up on Instagram. You just don't see it. And so how can we be talking about the reality of things that exist behind social media? I think is so important conversationally.
That's great.
Jump in.
Yeah, that's good. Again, my whole thing is how important the spirituality is, the spiritual connectivity. I work with a group of kids that are members of Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and we talk about social media, and they tell me all the time, they say, Ms. Haywood, the only way to filter it out is Jesus has to do the filtering. They said he holds us accountable, and without Jesus, we get those images, and they lodge there, and they stay there. And we just talk about how you have to be mindful of what goes in. It really lodges there. So I think if you really, like Sissy said, have those conversations with your child and help them to understand how damaging it can be and what it'll mean later on in your life, then I think it would probably make a difference. But again, Jesus is the answer.
Thank you.
Anyone? Oh, up here, Gage. Thank you.
So I'm not a parent, but I was just so taken aback by Lecrae's statement about how he was taught to operate out of fear instead of compliance. And I'm curious, y'all's perspectives on our upcoming generation. How do we teach our children about how to approach racial tension that currently exists in our country and abroad, and is teaching operating out of fear or compliance the right trajectory or the right way to approach it? And then also the idea that he was in survival mode, and you're talking about our children are being coddled. That drastic difference of surviving and coddling bothers me. And how do we bridge the gap between the two, because both don't seem a right way to go about living?
You want to jump in? I didn't understand the question.
How do we approach that tension between coddling our children on the one hand and engaging with racial tension that they're around experiencing all the time? And Lecrae talking about how he was raised, he kind of had more of a posture of fear than compliance when it came to the police. That tension of do we coddle too much, but then also Lecrae's statement was a very different perspective, I think, than a lot of folks have.
I think that's a very legitimate question, and I'm as I hear it, I think about me teaching at the alternative school, and I read a lot about the tension across the country and how it looks and how it feels, and I think a lot of times we have to be intentional about bridging the gap. Again, when I was teaching at the alternative school, we had police officers that walked all day long in and out of our classes. And when they would come in, the kids would just tense up and they were fearful, and they called them the enemy. So I asked them, why are they the enemy? Well, for all the obvious reasons, Ms. Haywood. So what I did, I said, well, I think I need to bridge the gap. And I had the policeman to come in an hour, and I had all the kids in one place like this, and the police would interact with them and tell why they became policemen, and they all became friends with the policeman. And after a while, it was almost like, well, why didn't you have the policeman to talk to us this week, Ms. Haywood? He's our friend. But I think we're going to have to start conversations and have the policemen to interact with society, and we have to create an atmosphere of love instead of adversity.
You guys have anything you want to add to that one?
I think the only thing I would add is in terms of bridging the gap and what you said about the coddling, the disparity between the coddling and the survival of, I just think it's so important to serve with our kids and connect different communities and let them see. I think, again, especially adolescents are so narcissistic just in terms of their development. And so helping them see a bigger world and helping them see past themselves is so important in terms of that.
I want to thank everybody for coming. We're going to wrap this up, but this has been a great evening. I think one of the great values of hearing presentations like this and asking these kinds of questions, Ross and Kirsten's conversation with Gabe, that there's a great value in, I think Kirsten said it well when she said, we learn the strength of our own positions when they're tested in conversation with people who don't hold the same positions that we hold. It's incredibly valuable for us to be around people who don't see the world in the same way that we do. It may not even be that we disagree. It's just that we have such vastly different experiences that we do well to learn from each other. So I want to thank everybody for coming. Thanks for the presenters. Thank you guys for being here. This has been wonderful. Thanks to Christ Presbyterian Church for all the work that you put into hosting this. Thanks to Daystar and Rabbit Room for being sponsors of the evening. Don't forget, if you want to participate in the Q 2017, that's actually here in Nashville. So that'll be easy to be a part of if you live in this town. And finally, we want to invite you back here on November 6th. There's information in the program that you received on the way in for Christ Presbyterian's Election Week Politics Forum. This is going to be a great thing. It's going to be 2 days before the 2016 presidential election. And here in this room, we're going to have a candid interview with Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam, the Republican governor of Tennessee, and Michael Ware, who is a consultant and former Obama White House campaign staffer, and also Christ Pres senior pastor Scott Sauls are going to be part of that panel. The panel is going to be moderated by Nashville News personality Samantha Fisher of WKRN, and that's going to be a great evening of just what does it mean to be a Christian in this particular climate, and hearing from some people who are really, really in it. Again, that's here on November 6, 2016 from 4 to 5:30. There's going to be childcare available at that event for children 12 and under. Feel free to linger here as we go, get some more coffee, enjoy the refreshments, continue conversations. Unless you have children in the childcare, go get them first and then come back. Let me say a quick prayer as we dismiss. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this time this evening that we've been able to gather and listen and think and talk and stretch and grow. Lord, we trust that you are sovereign over all things, and we also acknowledge that we come to issues like we've talked about tonight from a very earthbound perspective. And so we're limited. Give us mercy, give us grace, give us humility. And we thank you for our time together here in this place. It's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. Have a good evening, everybody.